I've always been comfortable on the road. There's something soothing about the rhythm of tires rolling over asphalt, the hum of the engine, and the endless expanse of sky overhead. Driving is a kind of therapy for me, a way to escape everything that weighs me down. I've done my fair share of road trips, and when things get overwhelming, when the walls close in and the noise becomes too much, I get behind the wheel and just go. This trip, though, wasn't about clearing my head. It was about running. Running from the mess back home, from the life I'd built that was crumbling at the edges. Running from the silence that had taken over my house ever since Kara left. It's been 2 weeks. 2 weeks since she packed her things into that old red suitcase and walked out the door without so much as a glance back. She told me it wasn't my fault, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was. Maybe I didn't listen enough. Maybe I wasn't around enough. Whatever it was, it had pushed her away, and I was left alone, staring at the empty spaces where she used to be. After a few days of wallowing, I couldn't take it anymore. The house was too quiet, too still, and everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her. The pillow she used to rest her head on, the coffee cup she always left on the counter, her hair ties scattered across the bathroom sink. I couldn't stay there. I needed to get out, to get as far away from that emptiness as possible. So, I grabbed my duffel bag, threw in some clothes, and hit the road. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just drove, heading west on a vague whim, chasing the horizon like it held the answers I was too afraid to confront. The first couple of days were fine. I stuck to the highways, stopping at greasy diners and motels that smelled like mildew and old cigarettes. But as I drove farther, the roads became emptier and the towns more spaced out. I wasn't sure when I started feeling it, that creeping sense of unease. But by the third day, the miles had started to blur together and the road began to feel more like a trap than an escape. That night, I was on a highway I didn't recognize. It was one of those back roads that seems to stretch on forever, cutting through dense woods with no sign of civilization for miles. My GPS had stopped working hours ago, and my phone was stuck on no service, leaving me to navigate by the fading road signs and my own gut instinct. The air outside the car was thick with humidity, and the sky was a deep, starless black. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 1:17 a.m. I'd been driving for hours, the road an endless ribbon of asphalt with no signs of life. No other cars, no lights in the distance, nothing but trees and the oppressive weight of the night. I was tired, bone tired. My eyelids felt heavy, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, as if the motion would keep me awake. I needed to stop soon, find a place to sleep, but I hadn't seen a gas station or motel in miles. The last town I'd passed had been little more than a few dilapidated buildings and a closed diner, and that was nearly an hour ago. As I drove, the forest on either side of the road seemed to close in, the trees leaning closer and closer, their branches forming jagged shapes in the darkness. My headlights carved out a narrow path through the black, but beyond that, everything was a blur of shadows and shifting silhouettes. Then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever find my way back to civilization, I saw the sign. Rest, stop, 10 miles. Relief washed over me. 10 miles wasn't far. I could make it. I'd stop there, stretch my legs, maybe grab a drink from a vending machine, and then decide whether to sleep in the car or keep pushing through. I pressed down on the gas, eager to put the last few miles behind me. The road stretched out ahead, seemingly endless, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The air inside the car felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I cracked the window slightly, letting in the cool night air. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the trees, something flickering at the edge of my vision. But as I got closer, it became clear. There was a man standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path, illuminated by the glow of my headlights. He was facing away from me, his back to the car, his figure outlined in the pale light. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively slowed down, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. What the hell was he doing out here? There were no houses, no cars, nothing for miles. And yet, there he was, standing alone on the deserted highway in the dead of night. I brought the car to a stop about 10 feet from him, my headlights casting his shadow long and thin across the road. He was tall, lanky, with matted hair that hung down to his shoulders. His clothes were dark, torn, and stained, and he stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from the night itself. I rolled down the window, the cold air biting at my skin. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. A wave of unease washed over me. Something about him felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an air of unnatural stillness around him, as if he didn't belong here. I should have driven off right then, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned out a little farther. "Do you need help?" I asked again, louder this time. He remained silent, unmoving. My pulse quickened and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he was just standing there. My headlights cast an eerie glow around him, but he remained in shadow, his face hidden. I was about to roll up the window and get the hell out of there when he moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he raised his arm and pointed down the road in the direction I had been heading. A cold chill ran down my spine. His movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were guiding me towards something. His arm stayed raised, his finger pointing into the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. What was he pointing at? Why was he out here in the middle of nowhere, directing me down a deserted highway in the middle of the night? I didn't want to find out. Without another word, I rolled up the window and pressed down on the gas, my hands shaking as the car surged forward. I swerved around him, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped past. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was still standing there, watching me. The rest stop was only a few miles ahead, but the knot of fear in my stomach twisted tighter with each passing minute. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me, but the highway was empty. Just a long stretch of black asphalt, disappearing into the distance. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. It was just some drifter, I told myself. Someone who had gotten lost, or maybe hitchhiking. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, pointing. The rest stop was small and deserted. Just a couple of picnic tables, a vending machine, and a bathroom shack with flickering lights. There were no other cars in the lot, no signs of life. The place felt abandoned, forgotten. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, the sudden silence pressing in on me like a weight. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my heart still racing. The man from the highway was burned into my mind, his eerie stillness, the way he had pointed down the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I needed to stretch my legs, clear my head. I got out of the car, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The lights from the vending machine buzzed overhead, casting long, wavering shadows across the lot. I glanced around, half expecting to see the man emerge from the trees, but the rest stop was empty. I walked over to one of the picnic tables, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and sat down, trying to steady my nerves. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The trees surrounding the lot rustled softly in the wind, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers. I leaned back, staring up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees, and the moon hung low and pale, casting an eerie glow over everything. The rest stop felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes hidden in the darkness, waiting for me to let my guard down. I glanced at the bathroom shack, the flickering light casting strange, jittery shadows on the walls. The door creaked slightly in the breeze, swinging open and shut with a slow, rhythmic motion. I should have felt relieved to stop, but the longer I sat there, the more the unease grew. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, movement at the edge of the lot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned to look. There, just beyond the reach of the flickering light, something moved between the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks, too fast for me to make out clearly. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the movement. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. But there was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. I took a step back, my heart racing, the rest stopped, suddenly feeling too open, too exposed. My instincts were screaming at me to get back in the car, to leave this place behind and keep driving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching me from the darkness. I glanced toward the car, and that's when I saw him. Standing at the edge of the lot, half hidden in the shadows, was the man from the highway. He was standing perfectly still, just as before, his arm raised, pointing down the road. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. He was back. How could he have gotten here? I had left him miles behind. It wasn't possible. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought he would disappear, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But he didn't. He stayed there, motionless, his finger still pointing. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the car. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. I couldn't stay, I couldn't face him again. I didn't want to know what he was pointing at. I finally got the door open and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were trembling so badly that I dropped the keys onto the floor. I bent down, my fingers scraping against the rubber mat. But when I looked up, he was gone. The lot was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I jammed the keys into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning for a moment on the gravel before catching traction and launching the car forward. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was still there, watching me from the trees. For the next hour, I drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my mind spinning with panic. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I had seen him, hadn't I? The man from the highway. But how? How had he gotten to the rest stop? How could he have known where I was going? The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating, and I cracked the window, letting in the cold night breeze. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road behind me, but the highway was empty. Just miles and miles of dark asphalt, disappearing into the night. I checked the dashboard clock, 3:03 a.m. I frowned. That couldn't be right. It felt like I'd been driving for hours, but the clock hadn't moved. I glanced at my phone, but it was still stuck on no service, the time frozen at 3:03 a.m. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the trees on either side swaying in the wind like skeletal hands. My headlights flickered just for a moment, and in the brief flash of darkness, I thought I saw something moving in the trees. A shadow, darting between the trunks. I blinked and it was gone. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I sped up, the car hurtling down the highway. The knot of fear in my stomach was growing, twisting tighter with every passing mile. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the road was leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. And then, up ahead, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. It was him, again. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just feet from the man. He was standing in the exact same position as before, his arm raised, pointing down the road. I stared at him, my pulse racing, my mind reeling. How was this possible? I had left him behind, twice now. But there he was, standing in the middle of the highway, pointing, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I swerved around him, my foot pressing hard on the gas as I sped past. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was still standing there watching me. But as I drove, the knot of fear in my stomach grew tighter. I knew deep down that I wasn't alone on this road, that no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I went, the man would be waiting for me. The clock on the dashboard flickered again. 3:03 a.m., the same time, again. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and dark, but I knew what was coming. I knew who was coming. And then, there he was, standing in the middle of the road, waiting for me. I sat there staring at the figure in the road. My breath was coming in short, uneven gasps, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The man was still there, standing perfectly still, his arm raised, pointing. Why was he pointing? Every part of me was screaming to drive, to leave him behind again, but I knew no matter how fast or far I drove, he would be there, waiting for me down the road, the endless road, the road that refused to end. I took a deep, shaky breath, my eyes fixed on the figure. Maybe I should follow where he was pointing. Maybe I should see what he wanted me to see. But the thought of it, of leaving the safety of my car, filled me with dread. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping deeper into a nightmare with each passing mile. For a moment, I sat frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The man didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, like a grim statue, his finger pointing down the highway, urging me forward. I took one last glance at the dashboard clock. 3:03 a.m. It hadn't changed. It was still stuck on the same time, just as it had been for the past hour. Or had it been longer? I swallowed hard and took a deep breath. Screw it, I muttered under my breath. I didn't have any better options. Driving endlessly wasn't going to work. So I pressed down on the gas and slowly rolled the car forward, inching past the figure. As I did, I forced myself to look at him. His face was still partially in shadow, but I could see just enough. His eyes were wide, hollow, and unblinking, as if they had been forced open. His skin looked pale, almost translucent, and his lips were slightly parted, like he was about to say something, but never quite managed to get the words out. I shuddered, tearing my gaze away as I passed him. He didn't turn to look at me. He didn't follow me with his eyes. He just stayed there, pointing, his arm outstretched as I left him behind again. I kept driving, faster now. The trees seemed to loom closer to the road, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, reaching out like claws. The road was empty, just as it had been before, but the further I drove, the more I felt a suffocating pressure building in the air around me. And then the radio turned on by itself. The speakers crackled with static, loud and sudden, making me jump in my seat. I glanced down at the dashboard, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't touched the radio in hours. It had been off since the last station faded into static. But now, the volume was rising, filling the car with a low, garbled noise, like a broken transmission. I reached for the dial, trying to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The static grew louder, more intense, and buried within it, I could hear something else, a voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper beneath the crackling hum, but as I strained to listen, it grew clearer. A low, distorted voice, speaking in short, broken phrases. Turn back. The words were barely audible, like they were being spoken from far away, but I could make them out. My blood turned to ice. I turned the volume down, but the voice persisted, whispering from the static. Turn back. Don't go. I slammed my hand against the radio, trying to turn it off, but it stayed on, the static hissing louder and louder until it filled the car like a physical presence. I gritted my teeth and yanked the knob as hard as I could. Finally, the radio clicked off and the car was plunged back into silence. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The voice echoed in my mind, each word lingering like a shadow. I had to keep driving. I couldn't turn back now, even though every part of me was telling me I should. The road stretched on, an endless black ribbon disappearing into the night. I pressed down on the gas, the car speeding faster and faster as I tried to outrun the fear gnawing at my insides. But then, just as I thought I'd left the worst behind me, the temperature in the car plummeted. The cold hit me like a wave, seeping into my skin, my bones, like I'd just stepped into a freezer. I glanced at the dashboard. The temperature gauge hadn't moved, but it didn't matter. I could feel it. The air around me had grown icy, the windows frosting at the edges, a thin layer of condensation creeping across the glass. I rubbed my hands together, trying to fight off the sudden chill, but it was no use. The cold was unnatural, bone deep, like it was seeping up from the road itself. My breath came in short, rapid puffs, visible in the air like smoke. I turned up the heater, but nothing happened. The car's systems were dead. The temperature gauge still read normal, but I knew that was a lie. And then, through the frost on the windshield, I saw something. Up ahead, just at the edge of my vision, there was a figure. Another one. Standing in the middle of the road. My stomach twisted in knots as I instinctively slowed the car. It wasn't the same man. This one was different, shorter, bulkier. He wore a tattered coat that fluttered in the wind, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But like the first man, he stood completely still, waiting for me. Just standing there like he had been expecting me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't keep stopping, but if I swerved around him, I had no idea what would happen. My mind raced as the car inched closer to him, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I honked the horn, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't move, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, staring down the road. I swallowed hard and decided to try something else. I rolled down the window, just an inch, and leaned out, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Hey, move out of the way!" No response. I honked again, louder this time, but he didn't react. My heart pounded in my chest, fear crawling up my spine like icy fingers. What was happening? Who were these people? And why were they all just standing there like they were waiting for something? I didn't want to find out. With a shaking hand, I reached for the gear shift and slammed the car into reverse. The tires screeched as I backed up, my eyes never leaving the figure in the road. I had to turn around. I couldn't go any further. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. But as I reversed down the highway, the figure didn't disappear. He stayed in my line of sight, somehow always just ahead of me, no matter how far I backed up. My heart sank. I couldn't escape. The road was changing, bending, keeping me locked on a path I couldn't deviate from. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, mixing with the frost forming on my skin. I shifted back into drive, knowing there was no other choice. The figure waited, his face hidden, his presence an immovable block in my path. I couldn't drive forward. I couldn't go back. I don't know how long I sat there, my breath fogging up the glass, the cold digging deep into my bones. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching, or maybe waiting. The radio crackled again, faint static creeping through the silence, and I clenched the steering wheel tighter. I didn't want to hear that voice again. I didn't want to listen to whatever message was buried in the static. But then the whisper came, low and insistent. Only this time it wasn't garbled. The voice was clearer now, more distinct, like it was coming from inside the car. "Don't go forward." My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, trying to turn off the car, but the ignition was stuck. My body was shaking with a mixture of fear and the cold that was now so intense that my fingers were starting to go numb. And then, the figure stepped toward me. One step, slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as he took another step, his shadow growing larger, darker as he approached the car. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward toward him. I didn't care anymore. I needed to escape. I needed to get away. But just as the car hurtled toward him, The figure vanished. He was gone, like he had never been there. I swerved, the tires skidding on the asphalt as the car spun out of control. I fought with the steering wheel, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The car veered off the road, crashing into the trees at the edge of the highway. The impact knocked the breath out of me, and for a moment everything went black. When I came to, the world around me was silent. The car was still, its engine dead, the front end smashed against a thick tree trunk. My head throbbed, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I groaned, trying to sit up, but my body felt heavy, weighed down by the cold. The frost on the windows had thickened, turning the inside of the car into a freezer. I reached for the door handle, my fingers numb, and managed to push the door open. The air outside was frigid, the ground covered in a thin layer of frost that hadn't been there before. My breath came out in ragged puffs, and I stumbled out of the car, my legs weak beneath me. The highway was empty. The trees loomed overhead, their branches creaking in the wind. But there was no sign of the figure, no sign of anyone. I was alone. I staggered to my feet, glancing down the road. The car was totaled. There was no way I was driving out of here. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the cold biting at my skin, and started walking. There was nothing else I could do. I walked for what felt like hours, the highway stretching endlessly ahead, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The temperature seemed to drop with each step I took, the frost creeping up my legs, my arms, my face. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, my body shivering violently as I trudged forward. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A light. Faint, flickering, but unmistakable. Hope surged through me, and I quickened my pace, my legs shaking beneath me. Maybe it was a house. Maybe there was someone there who could help. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, clearer, until I could make out the shape of a building. It was small, run down, with a single flickering lantern hanging from a post outside. The windows were dark, but the door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I stopped at the edge of the property, my heart pounding in my chest. The building looked like it had been abandoned for years, the paint peeling from the walls, the roof sagging in places. But the lantern was still lit. I swallowed hard, a knot of fear twisting in my stomach. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me, but the cold was unbearable, and I had no other choice. I stepped toward the door, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I heard something. Something faint, just beneath the howl. A whisper. "Turn back." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was the same one from the radio, the same one that had been warning me all night. I shook my head, forcing myself to keep moving. I didn't have a choice. I had to find shelter. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, but the air was warmer than outside. I closed the door behind me, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The inside of the building was small, just a single room with a few pieces of old furniture covered in dust. There was a fireplace at the far end, cold and unused, and a staircase leading up to a second floor. I shivered, rubbing my arms as I made my way toward the fireplace. Maybe there was wood I could use to start a fire, something to keep me warm until morning. I just needed to last until daylight. But as I reached the fireplace, I heard it again. A whisper. "Don't go upstairs." I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper was clearer now, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from inside the house. I backed away from the fireplace, my pulse racing. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like something was watching me from the shadows. I glanced at the staircase, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The stairs creaked softly in the wind, the door at the top of the staircase slightly ajar. I knew I shouldn't go up. I knew I should turn around and leave, but something was pulling me forward, something I couldn't explain. I took a step toward the stairs, my heart racing. Then another, and another. The stairs groaned under my weight with each step I took. I couldn't stop myself, even though my mind screamed to turn back, to leave that place. It felt like something was pulling me forward, compelling me to climb. The cold air of the highway still clung to my skin, but the warmth of the house felt artificial, almost suffocating. But I kept moving, as if I didn't have control anymore. My breath hitched in my throat when I reached the top of the stairs. The door was barely ajar, just enough for me to glimpse the dark, shadowy room beyond. The air up here was heavier, dense, like I was walking through thick fog. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pressed forward. My fingers brushed the edge of the door, and it swung open with a soft creak. Inside was a small, bare room. The light from the hallway barely penetrated the darkness. My eyes strained to see into the gloom, and at first it seemed like nothing was there. Just an empty space, a forgotten relic of an old house. But then I saw it. A figure, sitting in the far corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. I froze, staring at the motionless shape. It was slumped forward, head tilted slightly down, its form barely visible in the darkness. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to run back down the stairs, back to the highway, back to anything that wasn't here. But I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor. That's when it moved. The figure shifted slowly, as if it hadn't moved in years. Its head lifted, and I caught a glimpse of its face in the dim light. A gaunt, pale face with hollow eyes, wide and staring, just like the man I'd seen on the highway. I took a step back, my pulse racing, but the figure raised its arm, just like before, and pointed. My heart nearly stopped. This time, the finger wasn't pointing down a road or at something far away. It was pointing directly at me. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the whispering returned, louder now, filling the room. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was everywhere, inside my head, surrounding me, squeezing me like a vice. The figure in the corner didn't move again, but its hollow eyes never left me. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my vision blurring. I turned and ran down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The whispering followed me, chasing me down the staircase, filling my head with its haunting message. "You can't leave. You're part of this now." I burst through the front door and stumbled into the cold night air. The icy wind hit me like a punch, but I welcomed it. It was real, cold, tangible, and it snapped me back to reality. I could hear the sound of my own breath, ragged and fast, and the crunch of frost beneath my boots as I ran toward the road. But when I reached the edge of the highway, I froze. Standing in the middle of the road was the man from before, the one who had pointed me down this path. His thin, pale figure was bathed in the dim light from the moon, and his eyes, those wide, hollow eyes, stared right at me. I took a step back, but then I saw them. More figures, dozens of them, emerging from the trees on either side of the road, their gaunt faces and skeletal bodies swaying as they moved. Each of them was pointing at me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, and I started running. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran. The cold air burned my lungs, but I couldn't stop. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps soft but constant, closing in. The road stretched out ahead of me, endless and unforgiving. The forest on either side seemed to warp and bend, twisting into grotesque shapes. My vision blurred, but I kept running. My legs were shaking, my muscles screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, drowning out everything else. "You can't escape. You're part of this now." I stumbled, my foot catching on a loose patch of gravel, and I fell hard onto the asphalt. Pain shot up my arm as I hit the ground, but I barely registered it. I could feel them getting closer, the figures, the whispers. I forced myself to stand, but my legs felt weak, like they couldn't carry me any further. And then up ahead, I saw it, headlights. A car was coming down the highway. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. I waved my arms, screaming, trying to get the driver's attention. The headlights grew brighter, the engine roaring as the car approached. But as it got closer, something changed. The car slowed. The lights flickered, then dimmed, as though they were being swallowed by the darkness. The car came to a stop in the middle of the road, just a few feet away from me. I froze. There was no driver. The car sat there, engine idling, empty. The whispering returned, louder than ever, flooding my mind with a single horrifying thought. This was my car. I was trapped, caught in a loop. The highway, the rest stop, the figures, they weren't just following me. They were part of me now. I was part of them. The moment I had stopped for that man on the road, the moment I let him point me forward, I had sealed my fate. I was never leaving. The whispering swelled, filling my head, my ears, my body. You can't leave. You're part of this now. Forever. I took a step toward the car, my heart pounding, the cold seeping deeper into my skin. The figures were closing in behind me, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. I reached for the door handle. My hand trembled as I touched the cold metal. The moment my fingers wrapped around the handle, the whispering stopped. Everything was silent. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, my breath coming in slow, shallow gasps. The car was exactly as I had left it, the keys still in the ignition, the dashboard clock still frozen at 3:03 a.m. I stared at the clock, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. The clock still blinked at 3:03 a.m., frozen in time. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive, anywhere, as long as it was away from here. But just as I was about to press the gas, a thought hit me. The figures had always pointed forward, always led me down the road. What if that was the trap? My pulse quickened. I shifted into reverse. The car lurched back, the cold air thick with silence. As I backed up, the headlights illuminated the dark figures, standing at the edges of the road, watching me, their hollow eyes locked on mine. But this time, I didn't stop. I didn't follow the path ahead. I reversed farther, back from where I had come, my breath tight in my chest, half expecting the road to twist again, to trap me. But it didn't. The air suddenly felt lighter. The cold began to lift. The clock flickered. 3:04 a.m. I hit the gas, turned the car around, and sped back down the highway, the trees parting, the night finally breaking. The figures disappeared in the rearview mirror. I was free.